Marcus stepped away from the grave before the last shovel of earth had settled. "Ma'am." The voice stopped Clara Bennett halfway to her car. She turned and saw every uniformed officer nearby snap to attention. A 3-star general was walking directly toward her. For a second, she looked behind herself, convinced he had mistaken her for someone else. He hadn't. He stopped inches away, removed his gloves, and held out his hand. "You are Clara Bennett." "Yes, sir." He gripped her hand firmly, studying her face with an expression that looked less like sympathy and more like relief. "I served with your mother." Clara blinked. "My mother was only a Naval Intelligence Officer." The general's eyes narrowed. "Only." He glanced toward the freshly covered grave before looking back at her. "Go to Brussels." She frowned. "I'm sorry." "Give them your mother's name." He paused. "They'll understand." Before Clara could ask another question, aides surrounded him. Within seconds, he was gone. She stood frozen beside her mother's grave, while one question echoed louder than the military salute that had just ended. Who exactly had her mother been? Rain soaked the rows of white headstones as the cemetery workers quietly packed away folding chairs. The funeral had lasted less than 30 minutes. No speeches about heroism. No stories from former comrades. No medals displayed beside the flag. Just a folded flag placed into Clara's trembling hands and a brief prayer before everyone drifted away. It felt painfully ordinary. Her mother had spent 26 years in the Navy as a Naval Intelligence Officer, yet only a handful of people had attended. She had lived quietly, retired quietly, and now she had been buried the same way. Beside her, Uncle Richard adjusted his umbrella. "Your mother never cared about recognition," he said flatly. "Truth is, she never really did anything remarkable." Clara looked back at the fresh grave. That was exactly what her mother had always insisted. Whenever Clara asked about deployments, overseas assignments, or dangerous missions, her mother would smile and say, "Most days were paperwork, sweetheart." Richard patted her shoulder. "Let's get the estate settled. There's nothing there except the house, some savings, and old uniforms." She nodded weakly. Then the general had appeared. Now, as she drove to her mother's house, Richard's reaction replayed in her mind more than the general's words. He hadn't looked confused. He had looked frightened. Hours later, Clara unlocked the front door. Everything appeared normal until she walked into the study. Cabinet drawers hung open. Storage boxes had been shifted. Dust patterns showed someone had searched the shelves before she arrived. Nothing valuable seemed missing. Instead, it looked as though someone had been searching for one very specific thing. Who had entered her mother's house before the funeral was even over? And what were they so desperate to find? ***, Clara barely slept before boarding the overnight flight. Richard's warning echoed through her thoughts. "If you go, you may learn things your mother never wanted you to know." For the first time in her life, she wondered whether the woman who had raised her had been hiding an entirely different existence. The next morning, she returned to the house before leaving for the airport. Sunlight filtered through the curtains as she began sorting through the remaining boxes in her mother's study. There was nothing extraordinary. Cookbooks, tax returns, birthday cards Clara had made as a child, a worn leather Bible with handwritten notes in the margins. Even the uniforms seemed almost disappointing. The ribbons were minimal, the fabric faded from years of storage. They belonged to someone who had simply done her job and gone home. Clara sighed. Maybe the general really did mistake Mom for someone else. Behind her, Richard entered carrying coffee. "I've already called an estate agent," he said casually. "The sooner we sell this place, the sooner you can move on." Clara looked up. "I haven't decided to sell." "You don't need this house." "No." She folded another uniform carefully. "But I need answers." Richard forced a smile. There aren't any. He crossed the room before quietly sliding one storage box farther beneath the desk. The movement was subtle. Too subtle. Clara noticed anyway. After Richard stepped outside to answer a phone call, she pulled the box back into the open. Inside were dozens of empty document folders. Each had typed labels. Nay. Brussels. Joint Intelligence Coordination. Dates stretched across nearly 20 years. Every folder was empty. When Richard returned, Clara held one up. What are these? He barely glanced at them. Administrative paperwork. Administrative paperwork. They emptied the files before retirement. You know that. It's standard procedure. His answer came too quickly. Before Clara could ask another question, he gathered the folders and stacked them neatly. Throw those away, he said. They're worthless. That single word made Clara stop asking questions. Worthless. The same word people always used when they wanted something hidden. Later that afternoon, Clara carried another carton into the living room. A small passport slipped between two photo albums and landed on the floor. She picked it up. Her mother's passport. She smiled faintly before opening it. The smile disappeared. Belgium. Belgium again. Belgium again. The passport contained entry and exit stamps covering nearly 2 decades. Not one trip. Not two. Dozens. Clara frowned. Her mother had always claimed overseas travel ended after basic training. So why were you in Brussels all these years? She searched the remaining contents of the box more carefully. Tucked inside an old notebook was a faded visitor badge. The NATO logo had nearly worn away. On the back was a phone number. She stared at it for several seconds before dialing. The call connected almost immediately. NATO administration. Clara swallowed. I'm calling because I found an old visitor badge that belonged to my mother. What is her full name? Commander Evelyn Bennett. Silence. Then the woman's tone changed completely. I'm sorry. Keys clicked rapidly in the background. Could you repeat the name? Evelyn Bennett. Another pause. One much longer this time. Finally, the receptionist spoke again. Miss Bennett, would you please remain available? For what? I'm unable to discuss this over the telephone. What does that mean? You will be contacted directly. The line disconnected. Clara lowered the phone. No explanation. No goodbye. Just disconnected. That evening, Richard arrived carrying paperwork. I've scheduled the appraiser. Clara didn't even look at the documents. I'm flying to Brussels tomorrow. His face froze. What? I booked the ticket. You need to cancel it. No. There's nothing for you there. The receptionist didn't sound like there was nothing. Richard's voice hardened. Your mother protected you by keeping her past buried. Clara met his eyes. Then let me decide whether it stays buried. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard picked up his car keys. At the front door, he stopped without turning around. His voice was almost a whisper. If you go. He paused. You may learn things your mother never wanted you to know. He walked out before Clara could answer. She watched his car disappear down the street. Instead of frightening her, his warning convinced her she was finally headed in the right direction. The moment Clara stepped into Brussels airport, she knew Richard had lied. A man in a dark suit approached before she even reached baggage claim. Miss Clara Bennett. She hesitated. Yes. He produced an identification badge. NATO Protocol Office. Clara stared at it. I think you've mistaken me for someone else. The man smiled politely. No, ma'am, we've been expecting you. Those 4 words sent a chill through her. Expecting me. She had only booked the flight the previous afternoon. 2 more officials joined him, taking her suitcase before escorting her to a waiting vehicle parked outside the terminal. No explanations. No questions. Only quiet professionalism. As the car drove through Brussels, Clara watched government buildings pass by while trying to understand how an ordinary school administrator had suddenly become someone's anticipated guest. The vehicle stopped outside NATO headquarters. Security officers checked her identification, then compared it with information already waiting on their screens. One officer looked up. "Welcome, Miss Bennett." Another quietly added, "Our deepest condolences." Clara nodded. "Thank you." She expected someone to direct her toward a reception desk. Instead, 2 senior officials personally escorted her through corridors lined with photographs, documenting decades of multinational operations. Uniformed officers greeted them respectfully. Several glanced at Clara with unmistakable recognition. She whispered to the woman beside her, Did they know my mother?" The official answered without slowing her pace. Many of them knew Commander Bennett. Commander. Not simply Evelyn. Not simply Mom. Commander Bennett. The title sounded strangely unfamiliar. They entered a conference room, unlike anything Clara had imagined. Historic photographs covered one wall. Maps filled another. Near the front stood a portrait, hidden beneath a navy blue cloth. Fresh flowers rested beside it. Someone had clearly prepared the room for a ceremony. A gray-haired official stepped forward. "Miss Bennett, we're honored you came." She looked around nervously. "I honestly don't understand why I'm here." His smile slowly faded. "You didn't receive your mother's correspondence." "My mother's what?" "The official packets." "What packets?" Several officials exchanged confused looks. One woman opened a folder. "Our records show multiple certified deliveries were sent to your uncle, Richard Bennett, following your mother's passing." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "My uncle handled the estate." The room became silent. The woman looked back down at the file. None of the acknowledgments were ever returned. Clara slowly shook her head. "I never saw any letters." For the first time since arriving, the officials looked genuinely concerned. Later that afternoon, Clara attended a private gathering with retired officers who had served alongside her mother. No television cameras. No reporters. Just men and women whose faces immediately softened whenever Evelyn Bennett's name was mentioned. One retired commander laughed quietly. "Your mother saved my career more than once." Another smiled. "She saved much more than careers." A third officer pointed toward an old photograph hanging nearby. "There she is." Clara turned. Her mother stood beside senior NATO commanders, studying intelligence maps during what appeared to be a major international operation. She looked calm, confident, entirely different from the quiet woman who baked birthday cakes and reminded Clara to wear a jacket during winter. The retired commander stepped beside her. She never wanted recognition. "Why?" He looked around before lowering his voice. "Because someone close to her could have been endangered." Clara's heart pounded. "Someone close? Me?" Every ordinary explanation she had believed for 33 years collapsed in that single sentence. Her mother hadn't avoided attention because she lacked accomplishments. She had refused it to protect her family. Clara immediately stepped outside and called Richard. The phone rang. Straight to voicemail. She called again. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Moments later, her attorney's name flashed across her screen. "Clara, where are you?" "Brussels. I've got a problem." "What happened?" "Your uncle listed several items from your mother's estate for immediate private sale this morning." Clara stopped walking. "What items?" We don't know yet. The auction paperwork only says historical military materials. She looked back toward NATO headquarters. Inside those walls were officials wondering why she had never received her mother's letters. Back home, Richard was trying to sell whatever he had hidden. Clara's voice became firm. File for an emergency injunction. You want the estate frozen. I want every single item frozen. She ended the call, knowing one thing with absolute certainty. Richard wasn't cleaning up an estate. He was racing against the truth. The investigators stopped beside Richard just as the master of ceremonies stepped away from the podium. Mr. Richard Bennett. Richard forced a nervous smile. There must be some mistake. The lead investigator remained calm. We need to discuss several government documents recovered from your storage facility. Every conversation in the hall stopped. Military officers who had gathered to honor Commander Evelyn Bennett turned toward the exchange. Richard glanced at Clara. For the first time, he realized she knew far more than he had expected. You've embarrassed yourself enough, he muttered toward her. Clara didn't answer. She simply held the wooden box containing her mother's letters. The investigators escorted Richard outside the hall while the ceremony continued. No one applauded. No one protested. The room understood that the recognition of one honorable officer would not be delayed by the actions of someone who had betrayed her memory. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone. Today we honor Commander Evelyn Bennett, a distinguished Naval Intelligence Officer whose service remained classified for decades. The large navy blue cloth covering the portrait was removed. A full-sized portrait of Clara's mother appeared before the audience. She wore the same calm expression Clara remembered from childhood. But this time, she stood in uniform, surrounded by NATO commanders. The audience rose together. Not because they were instructed to, because they wanted to. The applause filled the hall. Clara stared at the portrait with tears gathering in her eyes. This was the woman she had never truly known. A senior NATO official began reading portions of the recently declassified record. Commander Bennett coordinated multinational intelligence operations during a period of heightened international security threats. Photographs appeared on large screens throughout the hall. Her mother briefing Allied commanders, reviewing intelligence reports, working alongside officers from multiple nations. Then came the operation that had remained hidden for decades. Years earlier, intelligence gathered and analyzed by Evelyn Bennett had exposed a coordinated security breach targeting Allied military personnel stationed across Europe. Several early reports had dismissed the warning as incomplete. Commander Bennett refused to accept that conclusion. She continued verifying sources, connecting scattered intelligence from multiple agencies until the pattern became undeniable. Her assessment convinced senior commanders to alter operational plans. Those changes prevented a devastating attack against Allied personnel. Because the operation remained classified, the public never learned her name. She accepted complete anonymity without complaint. Listening from the front row, Clara finally understood why the three-star general had spoken so differently at the cemetery. He hadn't been honoring an ordinary veteran. He had been paying respect to someone who had quietly protected countless lives. That was why he had said only one sentence. Go to Brussels. Everything Clara needed to know had always been waiting there. The ceremony ended with one final presentation. The same three-star general walked onto the stage carrying a presentation case. He stopped before Clara. Your mother declined public recognition while she was alive. He opened the case. Inside rested her restored commendations, official citations, and service decorations that had remained confidential for years. Today, he said softly, her family accepts them on behalf of a grateful alliance. Clara accepted the case with both hands. The audience stood once more. This standing ovation lasted much longer than the first. It wasn't simply applause. It was decades of gratitude finally spoken aloud. Later that evening, Clara sat alone in a quiet room overlooking Brussels. She finally opened the wooden box. The first envelope simply read, "For Clara, when you're ready." She unfolded the letter. "If you're reading this, then the truth has finally become safe." Her mother explained why she had never spoken about her assignments. Not because she wanted secrets between them, because every mission depended upon silence. The fewer people who knew, the safer everyone remained. Another page caught Clara's attention. "I wanted you to grow up knowing your mother, not my profession." She smiled through tears. Her mother hadn't hidden her life out of distrust. She had sacrificed recognition so Clara could have an ordinary childhood. The final line nearly broke her. "History remembers victories. I only ever wanted you to remember that I loved you." Clara pressed the letter against her chest. For years, she had believed her mother left behind almost nothing. In reality, she had left behind everything that mattered. Back home, the legal consequences unfolded quickly. The court permanently removed Richard as executor of the estate. Investigators confirmed he had intentionally intercepted official government correspondence addressed to Clara. He had concealed estate documents and attempted to profit from historical military records and government property that did not legally belong to him. The recovered materials were returned to their rightful custodians. Among them were Evelyn Bennett's journals, official commendations, personal notebooks, and decades of carefully preserved correspondence. Extended family members who had accepted Richard's version of events were stunned by the truth. Several apologized to Clara after learning how completely they had been misled. Richard lost the respect he had spent years cultivating. His reputation collapsed under the weight of his own deception. Months later, Clara fulfilled one final promise to her mother. She donated copies of the declassified records and historical materials to a military history museum so future generations could learn about the quiet sacrifices made by intelligence officers whose names rarely appeared in history books. She kept only 3 things: the folded flag, her mother's handwritten letters, and the presentation case placed into her hands by the general. She also began speaking at military family events, reminding audiences that many of the greatest acts of service never become headlines. Sometimes they remain hidden for years, sometimes for decades, but they still matter. Whenever someone asked whether she wished her mother had told her everything sooner, Clara always gave the same answer: no. She smiled toward the folded flag displayed in her home. She told me exactly when it was finally safe. And for the first time since standing alone at that quiet military cemetery, Clara no longer wondered whether her mother had mattered. She knew the truth. Sometimes the greatest heroes leave behind no stories, only the courage for someone else to uncover them.